All right. Are there any other questions at this point?
Sir, how about the Book of Mormon, sir, and other books that were used in this present modern times?
Yeah, the Book of Mormon came into being in the 18th century, and we don't accept the Book of Mormon as being canonical. Nobody but the Mormons accept the Book of Mormon as being canonical. That question was decided in the first century. And we'll look at that in a little more detail in just a minute. Not the Book of Mormon particularly, but the fact that the early church decided early on what was canonical. And so let me get to that in a few minutes.
Thank you, sir.
All right. In recent years, there has been a movement among some scholars to discredit the canonical process. Scholars who discredit the canon formation are people like Walter Bauer, James M. Robinson, Elaine Pagels, Karen King, Marvin Meyer, Charles Hedrick, Helmut Kester, and Bart Ehrman. There has been a real attack on the canon. I believe that the motivation behind this is that they don't like evangelical Christianity. And so what some of them say is, in the very beginning, there were many different kinds of Christianity. The one
Sure.
that, yes.
Yeah, I just noticed that in my readings, Pagels and Marvin Mayer were very big or kind of authoritative on Gnostic Gospels.
Yes,
they were
they
really
are.
pushing the reading, the scholarship work on the Gnostic Gospels even now, and that's
right.
quite interesting.
Yes. There's a great interest in the Gnostic Gospels, and I don't know, maybe their theology tends to be Gnostic as well. There are Gnostics today.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Hedrick, I actually knew, and but what they say is that at the beginning there were many kinds of Christianity, one just as valid as the other, and it happened to be that what we call Orthodox Christianity won out. And so they want us to consider the other kinds of Christianity, like Gnostic Christianity, and give them a fair hearing and say, hey, they're just as valid as Orthodox Christianity. Well, no, because it needs to be traced back to Jesus himself. If it doesn't go back to Jesus, then why call it Christianity? Call it something else. Christianity comes from Christ. And it was the apostles that he assigned to be the ones who would carry his message to the world. So if you look at the background of several of these people, they have had experiences with the evangelical church that they didn't like, and there is an agenda there. They want to promote other kinds of Christianity, or what they call Christianity, and put down evangelical Orthodox Christianity. So they say that other forms of Christianity, in quotes, were as legitimate as Orthodox Christianity. They typify the canonization process as done by closed-minded, politically motivated church leaders, as arbitrarily deciding what books would and would not be accepted as authoritative by the church. This was popularized in the Da Vinci Code but it was being said by liberal scholars for some time. The Da Vinci Code, as well as these scholars, portrayed the selection of the books of our New Testament as a choice of corrupt politicians making choices of the books of the New Testament for political reasons. They ruthlessly rejected the Gnostic writings and included books of their own personal choice, according to them. That is simply historically laughable. The Gnostic writings weren't rejected, they never were considered in the first place. When you read the Gnostic writings, you enter into a whole different world. A few years ago, the discovery and publication of the Gospel of Judas made headlines and was featured in the National Geographic and in a TV special on the National Geographic Channel. And this is the cover of the National Geographic magazine that published the Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic document known as early as the 2nd century. So this just came to light here in the last few years, in the 2000s. And so we are for the first time seeing this document. But Irenaeus, writing in AD 180, wrote the following. Now, Irenaeus is one of the church fathers, okay? He's a good guy. Others, again, declare that Cain derived his being from the power above and acknowledge that Esau, Korah, the Sodomites, and all such persons are related to themselves. Remember when we talked about the Gnostics? We said that for them, the good guys in the Old Testament were the bad guys, and the heroes of the Old Testament, they say are the bad guys. On this account, they add, they have been assailed by the Creator, yet no one of them has suffered injury. For Sophia, wisdom, was in the habit of carrying off that which belonged to her from them to herself. They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas. But up until recent years, we did not have a copy of the Gospel of Judas. No one knew exactly what it said. But a copy was found. It was a Coptic translation from the Greek from the end of the 3rd century or from the beginning of the 4th century. Now, it, of course, tells us nothing about Jesus, nothing about the real Judas. This is all a fictitious Gnostic document. It tells us a lot about Gnosticism of the 4th century, but it tells us nothing about Jesus or Judas. Let me just read you a few things about the gospel or from the Gospel of Judas. Judas said, "Master, could it be that my seed is under the control of the rulers?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Come, but you will grieve much when you see the kingdom and all its generation." When Judas heard this, he said to him, "What is the advantage that I have received? for you have set me apart from that generation. Jesus answered and said, you will become the 13th, and you will be cursed by other generations, and you will come to rule over them. In the last days, there's something missing here. Jesus said, come that I may teach you about the things that no human will ever see. For there exists a great and boundless eon whose extent no generation of angels could see, in which is the great invisible spirit, which no eye of an angel has ever seen, no thought of the heart has ever comprehended, and it was never called by any name. And a luminous cloud appeared there, and he said, let the angel come into being as my attendant. And a great angel, the self-generated, the God of the light, emerged from the cloud. And because of him, 4 other angels came into being from another cloud, and they became attendants of the angelic self-generated. And the self-generated said, let Adamus come into being. And the emanation occurred, and he created the first luminary to reign over. Okay, I'm going to stop there. You can see that this is nothing like the genuine Gospels. Nothing at all. It's in a whole different world from the Gospels. And you can see why the early church never really accepted the Gnostic Gospels as being authentic, never even considered them being authentic. But I do want to read to you the last part of the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas. And this is what it says. I think you ladies will find this interesting. Simon Peter said to them, let Mary go out from among us, because women are not worthy of the life. Jesus said, see, I shall lead her so that I will make her male, that she may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, what do you think about that? Ladies, you've got to become male if you're going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, that is a Gnostic document from the 2nd century. All right. Yes, question? Question, comment?
Sir, that sounded like hogwash.
Well, yeah, I think you're probably right.
Very Greek, sounds like Greek mythology or work of fiction.
It is,
It's a different. I also read a portion, sir, I know if Gospel of Thomas or another. It says that Jesus was telling the apostles that the closest to him was Mary Magdalene. Among the apostles, it was not Peter nor James or John, but it was Mary Magdalene.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of weird stuff that was written after the truly apostolic writings. Yeah. I want to give you a quote from James D.G. Dunn. Now, he's an evangelical scholar, probably not in the center, maybe on the fringe of evangelicalism, but really a noted scholar. And he says, the gospel about Jesus, the one sent from God, who died and was raised for our salvation, was canonical more or less from the first. It defined and identified the new sect of the Nazarenes. Now, this is the gospel. It gave canonical shape to the written expressions of the new faith, including not least, the Gospels. But it also determined more or less from the start what were less than adequate as expressions of that gospel. we should not forget the dynamic of the canon process. It is still sometimes assumed or implied that the New Testament writings did not function as canon until the church declared them canonical. This is simply an inadequate way to conceive of canon. Rather, we have to recognize that there were various writings which so impressed their first readers and hearers as church creating and church sustaining that they were retained by the recipients, reread, pondered, and circulated more widely. Something of this is already hinted at in the letters of Paul. In other words, they exercised a shaping, defining influence, a canonical authority from the first. Not everything written by a Christian leader in the first century became canonical. Some of Paul's letters, for example, were not retained. Q, which we're going to talk about in the next lesson, was not retained as Q. The fact that the New Testament writings were preserved is itself a testimony to the de facto canonical authority which they exercised more or less from the first. In short, the New Testament canon was not so much decreed as acknowledged. The New Testament writings were hailed as canonical in recognition of the authority they had been exercising from the first. Okay, in steadily widening circles, and this cuts me off at the bottom of the page here. Let me just pull this up. Since then, it was not the church that determines the gospel, but the gospel which determines the church. So Dunn says that from the beginning, there was more or less a canon. We have those writings that gave shape to the church and everything that proceeded. So it wasn't so much decided upon by a group, but it was simply acknowledged as what was already formative in the church and authoritative. Let me give you the okay, let me just look at this. The non-canonical books that were written sometime after the New Testament are called the New Testament Apocrypha. Here is a listing of the New Testament Apocrypha from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. And all I'm going to just do is show you these titles. They're arranged by the form. We have Gospels and related forms. So we have narrative Gospels, Revelation dialogues and discourses. Let's go back up. And yeah, different Gospels. We have sayings, Gospels, and collections. And then we have treatises, apocalypses. These are some of the apocalypses that we mentioned. Acts, letters, liturgical materials, and that is the New Testament Apocrypha. Now remember, there was the Old Testament Apocrypha, those books that the Roman Catholic Church acknowledges as being edifying, and it's in their Bibles. It's also in some of the Protestant Bibles as an appendix. That's the Old Testament Apocrypha. This is the New Testament Apocrypha, and nobody accepts these as being authoritative. Okay? Questions, comments?
Just a question. Is it
Yes.
I'm just thinking back to my childhood because I grew up in the church. Is
Uh-huh.
it considered strange for a pastor to then use any of the Apocrypha material to teach from in a church setting, or um, like, oh,
It would be strange in a Protestant church. Now, he can refer to those things, but he probably wouldn't refer to them authoritatively, say
mhm,
they are authoritative. He could refer to them to give background, to better understand some aspect of the New Testament. But it would be strange for a Protestant minister to refer to one of those as being an authority.
okay.
Yeah.
So then we need to know what they are so that we can avoid them, basically. Is that
Now, you're talking about the Old Testament Apocrypha, are you?
mm, the Old Testament Apocrypha, the New Testament Apocrypha? I'm just trying to understand, like, we know that there were other writings. They're not considered canonical, so therefore we shouldn't trust them. We shouldn't refer to them. We should stick to the canon. Is that essentially the essence of what we're trying to
Yes.
communicate
Yes,
here?
that is true. Now, in the New Testament, sometimes apocryphal letters are quoted, or pseudepigraphical letters are quoted, or documents. But that doesn't mean that they are authoritative. Jude does this, but it doesn't mean that Jude felt like that those documents were authoritative. I mean, after all, Paul quotes, Greco-Roman poets, and he certainly didn't believe that those were authoritative. And, the same thing with us today. You could use illustrations from the Apocrypha, especially the Old Testament Apocrypha, but we wouldn't say that those things are authoritative. Okay, they are helpful, and like the books of Maccabees, that really helps us understand the history between the testaments. Those are
Mhm.
very helpful, and but not authoritative.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we take a break?
What about Josephus and extra biblical writings? Why are they more readily used by pastors and scholars than these books? What is the difference?
Well, Josephus was a first century historian, and so his works are very valuable. These writings that we have here in the New Testament Apocrypha are not valuable in terms of giving us actual history. These are, I guess we could call them fiction. They are made up stories. And they are there to promote a doctrine that the church does not accept, for the most part. It's probably not totally heresy, but they certainly are not historical. There are some very strange things. If you read the Gospel of Peter, there are some very strange things in there. And these are much different from Josephus. Okay, Josephus gives us a lot of good information about Judaism in the first century. The book of Maccabees, the books of Maccabees in the Old Testament Apocrypha give us a lot of good information about the intertestamental times. But these books don't do that. These are not nearly as valuable.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and we will see you in 10 minutes. The first kind of genre that we're going to look at in the New Testament is that of the Gospels, and we're going to look at the Synoptic Gospels. First of all, let's look at higher and lower criticism. Who can tell me what lower criticism is? Lower criticism. Does anybody remember what lower criticism is? Okay, lower criticism is textual criticism. Okay, remember the textual criticism? How they looked at different variations in the text and decided which one was probably the original. That is lower criticism. So it deals with the authenticity of the text. Higher criticism deals with the aspects of the text like authorship, date, recipients, and that kind of thing. So we're going to be dealing with higher criticism now. We dealt with textual criticism or lower criticism before. The nature of the gospel literature. You know, we're all familiar with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What kind of literary works were these gospels? There's been a lot of debate about what kind of literature the gospels are. There are three primary options. First of all, a kind of ancient biography, much like the biographies of the Greco-Roman world. Of course, they're not identical with ancient biographies, but scholars like Burridge believe that they're close enough to be put in that category. Secondly, a historical monograph. Others say, no, the Gospels are not just about Jesus, but they're more about what God is doing through Jesus. So the story itself is central, not the person of Jesus himself. So they would say it's a historical monograph. Others would say it's a unique genre. People like Francis Watson and Martin Hengel, who believe that the genre of gospel is completely new. They do bear a resemblance to ancient biographies, but they would say that the differences are so substantial that they actually should be considered a different genre, unlike another one. Hengel calls them charismatic biographies. So which is it? The Gospels probably incorporate aspects of the three. I would probably say number three, a unique genre that bears some resemblances to ancient biography and historical monograph. Who can tell me what the word gospel means?
Good news, sir.
Good
Good
news.
news. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
What's that, Rebecca?
yeah,
Okay, the good news was the proclamation of the story of Jesus. Toward the end of the first century, the word gospel came to be used used for the story of Jesus in written form. Justin Martyr was the first to use this term in the plural, referring to individual books, which we call gospels. Euangelion is the Greek word that is translated gospel, or the evangel is translated gospel. The term evangelist originally meant one who preaches good news, but then it came to mean the writer of the Gospels. So we can call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John evangelists because they wrote the evangel, the euangelion, the Gospels. Of course, the Gospels are historical, but their aim is not just the reporting of historical facts by a detached historian. The Gospel writers never would have thought of their story of Jesus as simply an attempt to preserve for posterity what otherwise would have been lost. It was more than just keeping the memory of Jesus alive. For them, Jesus was not just a historical figure to be remembered. He was the living Lord to be experienced. James Denney said, "No apostle, no New Testament writer ever remembered Christ. Rather, they experienced his presence daily." So the one that they are writing about is the living Lord, one with whom they have a personal relationship. So it's different from simply a historian writing historical records from a detached stance, not getting personally or emotionally involved in this. This is the writing of the message of the early church. The Gospels were written for the purpose of presenting Christ in such a way that people would come to have faith in him and be saved. John wrote in his Gospel, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Luke wrote for a man named Theophilus, and his aim was for Theophilus to know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So Luke wanted to confirm the faith of Theophilus. So we see that the Gospels are theological documents. They are interpreted history. Besides giving us history, they give us the saving message of Jesus Christ. You know, history is not enough for salvation. We must believe in what we read, and we must have faith in the Jesus that the Gospels are talking about. You know, there are scholars like Reimarus and Strauss that we mentioned earlier, who know the Gospels. They have read the Gospels, but they don't have faith. And it hasn't led to salvation on their part. So they wrote, rather than from faith, they wrote from a hatred of the Gospels themselves. So the biblical writers were men of faith, imparting their faith to others. References to Jesus outside the Gospels. Now, of course, our primary information about Christ comes from the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. There is very little written about Jesus by his contemporaries outside the New Testament, but there is some written, and they confirm that Jesus lived and that the church came into being shortly after his death. So there are secular references to the life of Christ. There are 3 sources that I want to mention here of possible sayings of Christ outside the Gospels. The first is what we call agrapha. Agrapha are sayings of the earthly Jesus that were not written in the 4 Gospels. Okay? Do we have any record of what Jesus said that are not written in the 4 Gospels? They may be found in the New Testament outside the Gospels, in textual variants of later manuscripts, in the church fathers or in other collections. An example of an agrapha within the New Testament comes from Acts 20:25, where the saying of Jesus was given that says, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Paul quotes this in the book of Acts. It is a saying that Jesus said, but it doesn't come from the Gospels. It was a saying that none of the Gospel writers chose to include in their Gospels. Clement of Alexandria gives this quotation: "Ask for the great things, and God will give you what is small." And Origen gives this saying: "Be approved money changers." So did Jesus actually say this from Clement of Alexandria and Origen? We don't know for sure, but I think that there's a good possibility that he did. There are also collections of sayings. The greatest collections of these sayings that supposedly came from Jesus, which are also considered agrapha, are the Oxyrhynchus papyri and the so-called Gospel of Thomas. Now, when I was in seminary, I took a course from Dr. Everett F. Harrison on the life of Christ. And he mentioned the Oxyrhynchus papyri. And somebody asked, "How do you spell that?" And he said, "Well, it's spelled just like it sounds. Oxyrhynchus, just like it sounds." Well, I don't think if you tried to write it from how it sounds, you would come up with that spelling. The Oxyrhynchus papyri are a series of papyrus manuscripts found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt in 1897. One of those documents found there and elsewhere is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic document, probably compiled well after our New Testament Gospels. We already mentioned the Gospels when we talked about the canon. It was part of the Nag Hammadi collection of documents found at Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945 and 46. And it claims to be a collection of the sayings of Jesus. But it is a Gnostic document. There are 114 sayings, or logia as they are called. 40 of them are entirely new. They bear no resemblance to anything in the Gospels. Others are similar to the genuine sayings of Jesus, but with some kind of change made. And then there are some that are very similar to what we have in the Gospels. Are these genuine sayings of Jesus? Generally, I would say no. There might possibly be some that go back to a genuine saying, but we can't establish that. And if it does, how do we know that it hasn't been changed from the original saying? So we don't need to consider putting the Gospel of Thomas into the Bible. It was certainly written after the canonical Gospels, probably sometime in the 2nd century. It draws from many parts of the New Testament, which shows that some collection of the New Testament had already happened when the Gospel of Thomas was written. And remember that saying of Jesus that Mary had to become male so that she could be part of the kingdom of heaven. That is from the Gospel of Thomas. And then there are the apocryphal Gospels. Gundry calls these apocryphal Gospels a motley picture of heretical beliefs and pious imagination. All right. studying the Gospels. We're going to be looking at three different kinds of criticism regarding the Synoptic Gospels: source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. So let's first of all look at source criticism and the Gospels. And we're going to be looking here at the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. What do we mean when we talk about the synoptic problem? Here we deal with the interrelationships of the Gospels. There are some relationships because at times whole sections of the Gospels are the same. Now we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, word for word. At other times, a gospel will give a saying or a story that the other gospels don't have. So there is this relationship between the gospels. Now here's a little cartoon. The teacher is saying to the students here, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, see me after class. Your book reports are surprisingly similar. Okay? Now, are we going to say that they plagiarized? Well, no. But we are going to try to figure out what the relationship is between these Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are much more similar in content than the Gospel of John. And so they're called synoptic. Synoptic comes from two Greek words, syn, together, optic, to see. So it refers to these Gospels looking at the life of Christ from the same viewpoint. Now, to study the Gospels, one tool that really comes in handy is a gospel synopsis. And I would like to mention three here. I think we mentioned these when we talked about tools. Kurt Allen's Synopsis Quatuor Evangelorum, which is Greek. It gives the Greek in parallel columns. We also have Kurt Allen's Synopsis of the Four Gospels, the Greek English edition of the Synopsis Quatuor Evangelorum, and it gives the Greek on one page and the English on the other. And then we have Burton Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels. And this is all English. It deals only with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It doesn't include John. And it's from the New Revised Standard Version. Of the three of these, I would recommend the middle one, this Synopsis of the Four Gospels by Allen. It is really a superb work there. Synopses put the gospel accounts into parallel columns. Often they contain only the synoptic gospels, but sometimes they contain John as well. That way it is easy to compare them side by side. Now notice that these are not harmonies. Technically speaking, a harmony attempts to take the content of all the Gospels and put them into one seamless story. So they would start at the birth of Christ and write it as one story all the way through the ascension. Sometimes a motive for that is to get rid of anything that seems like a contradiction. And so how do you deal with that? Well, you say that this thing that is a little different in the Gospels happened twice, or maybe even three times. And there was one man by the name of Andreas Osiander in his Harmony of the Gospels. It was published in 1537. He had Jesus raising Jairus's daughter from the dead twice, healing the blind men at Jericho 4 times, being crowned with thorns twice, and Peter warming himself by the fire and denying the Lord 4 times. But they did this because they didn't want to say that this one gives it one way and that gives it another, and it's talking about the same thing. Even in our day, there are books that do this. Back in the 70s, maybe that's not our day now, but Harold Lindsell wrote a book entitled Battle for the Bible, in which he did that same kind of thing. Synopses are not like that. Synopses are parallel columns so that you can compare what is written in the various accounts. Now, one thing that muddies the water here is that sometimes synopses are called harmonies. So that sort of confuses things. Here is a sample page from the Synopsis Quatuor Evangeliorum of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Now you can see that it's in Greek. Actually, the headings are in German. Toward the right-hand side there, you have the healing of Peter's mother-in-law in English. And this is the way it looks. So if you know Greek, you can compare very easily what is written here. Here is the baptism of Jesus from Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels. And you can see that in Matthew, it's a longer treatment than in Mark or Luke. And if you want to see exactly the wording there, you can look at the various columns, and it makes it very easy. Okay, do you have questions or comments here so far? Okay, let us look at, was somebody saying something?
Yeah, I'm just, I remember that, yeah, actually I have a book on the harmony of the Gospels,
Okay.
and it has helped me with my Bible studies and before, and now with your explanation, should we disregard this in our studies?
I wouldn't disregard it. Just as you use it, realize what may be happening there. If it's just trying to smooth things out, just be aware of that possibility. That's all I would say. Okay. Okay.
Yes, the book I have is it's really just like the one you're presenting here, the baptism of Jesus, and I went into that page. It's specific, the same really, the parallel.
Okay.
Parallel
Good.
tendency.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's look at some facts about the Synoptic Gospels. First of all, their common subject matter. Mark has 661 verses. You can see that in that second from the left column. Matthew has 1,068, and Luke has 1,149. Of the 661 verses in Mark, 606 are found in Matthew. 350 are found in Luke. And of course, all 661 are found in Mark. Over 90% of Mark's verses are found in Matthew. In Luke, over 50% are found in Luke. 95% of Mark's verses are found either in Matthew or Luke. So we see there is some kind of relationship here. Common use of language. In terms of the actual words, Mark, excuse me, has 11,025 words. Matthew has 97.2 of Mark's actual words. Luke has 88.4 of Mark's actual words. Now, Jesus spoke Aramaic, and yet the three Gospels show great uniformity in the Greek language. Greek sentences have great flexibility in word order. You know, in English, word order is very important. So if I said, John hit Bill, then you know that John took his fist and hit Bill's face. But if I say Bill hit John, then you know that it was Bill who did the hitting. Word order is important in English, but in Greek, it's not, because you can tell which is the subject and which is the object by the endings of the words. So it's almost like you could take the words of the sentence, throw them up in the air, and however they land, you can still read the sentence. Okay? That's probably an exaggeration, but it's almost that way. But even here, the word order is very often exactly the same. Common outline and order. The sequence of Mark's outline is followed by the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Now, they're all not exactly the same. At times, Matthew will vary from Mark's order. At times, Luke will vary from Mark's order. But there is no place where Matthew and Luke agree in arrangement against Mark. So that's evidence that they were using Mark and then made variations there. So clearly, there is some kind of interdependence. Exactly what was that relationship between the Gospels? Okay? Now we're going to look at some proposed solutions for the synoptic problem. Attempts to give an answer to what the relationship between the Gospels was. The first one that we're going to mention here is the two-source hypothesis, or also called the two-document hypothesis. And this says that Mark was written first. Matthew and Luke then used Mark. And we call that Markan priority. This position depends on two beliefs. Number one, Markan priority, that Mark was written first, and also another document called Q. So this is just a little diagram here of how we can show this. Mark first, Matthew and Luke use Mark. Now, was Mark written first, or is there evidence that one of the other Gospels was written first? Most scholars today believe that Mark was written first. And Robert Stein has given a number of arguments for Markan priority. Okay, Markan priority means Mark was written first. Okay, all I'm going to do is list Stein's reasons. I may say a word or two about them, but I'm not going to go into detail. He gives the argument from length, argument from grammar. And this is basically that Mark tends to use poorer grammar. The grammar in Matthew and Luke is better, and so that would be an improvement. Argument from difficulty. There's more difficulty in Mark, and so Matthew and Luke tend to smooth out any difficulties that might be there. Arguments from verbal agreements and order. arguments from literary agreements, argument from redaction, an argument from Mark's more primitive theology. This says that Matthew and Luke show a more developed theology than Mark. All of this evidence points to Mark's being the first one that was written. The theory that fits all of this best is Markan priority. And the fact is that the vast majority of scholars today believe that Mark was written first. But we also mentioned what we called Q material. There are 235 verses that are common to Matthew and Luke, but do not appear in Mark. So how can we explain this? There are stories, there are sayings that appear in Matthew and Luke, but don't appear in Mark. Now, the theory here, at times it's virtually word for word. The theory here is that there was another document that they used. It's been called Q from the German word Quelle, which means source. Was this source written or oral? Well, the fact that at times it's word for word would seem to give credence to the fact that it was written. The matter is debated today, but I think that it must have been written. Now, we have never found a document called Q. It's hypothetical. It's theory. There maybe was this document that was written, but nobody can put their hands on a document called Q. Now, there are scholars like James M. Robinson who really go on this Q thing. You know, they say that they can find developments of Q in Matthew and Luke. They say that there was a community that used Q as their Bible. And Q is mainly sayings and not very much in the way of stories. So they would say that, you know, this community only cared about the sayings of Jesus, not about his life. And Q doesn't extend to the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. So they say this community didn't care about that. Well, I think we can put that theory to rest. I think it's more these scholars' imagination than anything having to do with fact. So this we call the two-source hypothesis. The two-source hypothesis. There was Mark, that was one source, and Q was the other source. Matthew used Mark and Q. Luke used Mark and Q. But now as we look at Matthew and Luke, we see that there are unique sayings, unique narratives there that do not appear in either Mark or Luke. If we look at Luke, we see that there is unique material there that does not appear in Matthew or Mark. So what do we say about that? Here we have another diagram. The unique material in Matthew, we label M. M just representing his unique material, which would be another source or maybe more than one source. The unique material in Luke, we would label L, and that would be, again, the unique material in Luke. So this is called the four-source hypothesis. This is the two-source hypothesis. But you can tell there's a very great similarity. And for convenience, I will probably just call all of it the two-source hypothesis, okay? Because they're very, very close. All right, it is time for us to stop for tonight, for today. Before we do you have any questions or comments? All right, we will stop here. Good day, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good night, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you.
sir.
Bless
Good
everyone.
night.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Dylan. Bye, classmates.
Bye, class.
Thank you.
Bye, Elvin.
Bye.